Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. Joining me this time around are two of our regulars, way over here on the far right, which we normally don't find him on the far right.
Oh man, that's scary. You got me scared.
Is Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western. He's also a city commissioner, former vice mayor of the city of Kalamazoo. To my immediate right is Denise Keele. Denise is a professor in the political science department at Western. She's also associated with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability.
Great job.
Did I get it right?
Yes.
Nice go.
I usually screw that one up, don't I?
I know, it's great.
Denise also is the chair of our climate change working group, does an excellent job at that. And joining us once again is Ed Martini, who's becoming somewhat of a regular on the program.
Stay.
I think we've had Ed here 3 or 4 times in the last year. Ed is a professor in the history department at Western, and he also is an administrator. He serves as the associate dean of the extended university programs.
Yes.
So, a little background to the topic for today. So, discussing with some folks at Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War planning meeting, we were talking about the current crisis in Korea. We didn't use that terminology at the time, but of course this was when Kim and Trump were kind of going back and forth with the insults, and the tension was rising. Trump was using that term "little rocket man,"
Yeah, right.
threatening fire and fury against North Korea. And of course, the North Koreans were launching these intercontinental ballistic missile tests, and we knew that they already had nuclear warheads, so it was becoming a very tense time. So we thought we should probably put together some kind of a program to sort of analyze this current crisis. It took us a while to get to the point where we could do that, but we did it about a week ago. Ed was on the panel with me and Randy LaPrairie, who was a guest on our program a while back. And so we sort of analyzed, but even by then, things had started to shift and change. I think the Olympics might have been one of the key moments when the North and South really started to get more engaged in their negotiations. And it was announced that there would be a summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim. It took place this morning, and so we're meeting on today. We're taping this program on April 27th, 2018, and earlier today in Korea, Kim came across, and in fact, I think he's the first North Korean leader to ever set foot in South Korea, as we understand it. They met at Peace House in Panmunjom, and again, they said, well, what we want to do is to have a permanent peace, to finally have a treaty to end the Korean War, and to begin the process of eliminating nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula. So this is a truly historic summit that took place earlier today. And it was something that we certainly didn't anticipate when we first started talking about having our panel and then you know, having a critical issues program. And this was not anything that seemed in the cards at that time. So we've got a lot to talk about today on this, and I'm going to turn to Ed first because Ed is an expert on the Vietnam War. But he's getting a lot of requests to talk about Korea, and so he has become, I think, also an expert on the Korean War. He taught a course for the Osier Lifelong Institute earlier this year. I took the course. It was an excellent course. I know you did an awful lot of preparation for that course.
Wow.
And but of course, very, very important right now to have that kind of broader historical context, because I think we often say Korea is the forgotten war. And I think a lot of Americans, especially maybe younger generations, don't really know much about this war. And I think unless you have an understanding of that war in the broader context, it's hard to understand why this is so historic, this event today that took place is so historic, and why the tensions have been rising. So I know it's difficult. You had 6 hours with the OLLI course. You've got considerably less time today, but can you at least sort of sketch out some of that history for us?
Sure. I mean, I think the key points are to understand sort of why the peninsula is divided, why it has become nuclearized, and why the war isn't over officially. I think those are kind of the key points that are driving these conversations. So the key point in terms of why it's divided, of course, is that after World War II, when the United States and its allies defeated Japan in particular in the Pacific War, it began an occupation, and like Vietnam and other parts of the world in those days, there were a lot of these temporary divisions and partitions of the country into a non-communist part and a communist part. I think it's important to state that it's a non-communist South Korea, but definitely not a democratic South Korea. The regime that we eventually set up in South Korea is far from democratic. But it was non-communist, and in the Cold War that was good enough. And so there was this partition, and the communist North became supported by initially the Soviet Union, and then later by China after the Chinese Revolution, in particular 1949. And the South was actively supported and also occupied by the United States, which set up a very dictatorial regime under Syngman Rhee, engaged in some pretty repressive campaigns there to eliminate leftist elements, something that didn't happen in places like Vietnam later on. And so you really had sort of two dictatorial regimes, one that was communist and one that was non-communist. And the tensions that were internal to Korea eventually boiled over. There were lots of skirmishes, there were a lot of internal dynamics about, most of which had to do more with China and Japan and the legacies of colonialism and occupation on the peninsula than anything else, certainly more than the Cold War. But those spilled over in June 1950 when North Korea invaded the South. And we probably don't need to go over the entirety of the war. One of the things that's interesting about the Korean War, and one of the reasons it's probably forgotten, is that the war itself is fairly uninteresting, at least from a military standpoint. You know, you have this kind of series of back and forths early on in 1950 where the United States intervenes and then the Chinese intervene, and then you have this essentially 2.5-year stalemate where nothing is resolved. So at the end of the war in 1953, you've essentially got the country divided just as it was before. You've got a non-communist regime supported by Russia and China, and you've got a communist regime rather supported by them, and a non-communist regime supported by the United States. So there's an armistice signed which temporarily ends the war, but it doesn't actually include a lasting peace. So technically the two Koreas are in a state of war. And the armistice, and this is important to remember too, is not signed by South Korea. It's signed by North Korea, it's signed by China, and it's signed by the United States. So as we think about what a peace would look like and what an actual end to the Korean War would look like, it means not just the North and South making progress and signing a peace treaty, although that might be part of it. The United States and China will also have to be involved too. And so that's something to keep in mind too, is that this will definitely involve ongoing negotiations between the US and China. So then quickly, you know, the issue with denuclearization, I always like to point out that while we focus on the North Korean nuclear weapons right now, it's the United States that first nuclearized the Korean Peninsula. We contemplated using tactical nuclear weapons during during the Korean War, and only really didn't move ahead with that plan because of the tension between MacArthur and Truman when MacArthur was relieved of his command. But during the 1950s, as we ramped up our military presence and as the DMZ in Korea became the most heavily armed border in the world, the United States started storing tactical nuclear weapons in the South Korean peninsula, and we're pointed towards North Korea, we're pointed towards China, we're pointed towards the Soviet Union, and at one point in the mid-1960s had over 900 nuclear warheads in South Korea. Those remained in place until the early 1990s. And so when we think about the nuclear threat and denuclearization, it's important to remember that the United States was the prime mover in that discussion. The North Korean program, while it took a long time to develop, really only escalated in the 2000s. And so that's the other thing to keep in mind. And then, you know, with respect to what's going on today, I think it's great. I mean, the symbolism of a North Korean leader setting foot in the South, shaking hands, talking about a lasting peace and a permanent peace rather than a permanent war is great, but it's important to remember, A, that so far this has really been symbolic. And that's good. Symbolism is important when it comes to diplomacy and statecraft, but there's a lot of details to be worked out. These are two regimes who both see themselves as the rightful rulers and rightful governments on the Korean Peninsula. I don't see any scenario under which the North Koreans are going to denuclearize anytime soon, now that their nuclear weapons program actually seems to be functioning pretty well. And that any negotiations, again, are going to involve the United States, Russia, China, Japan. There's some complex issues to be resolved here. And complexity doesn't seem to be a strength, I would say, of the current US administration. So there's progress, and it's interesting to watch, and we'll see what happens, but there's a lot of work left to be done before we're anywhere near an end to the war, let alone a lasting peace.
It seemed like it was a very interesting meeting today. The two leaders joking around with each other. Kim invited Moon to come to the north to visit and said he would be embarrassed by the roads.
The roads.
It was
Just like Michigan.
just like Michigan. But I thought that was sort of a strange admission. We don't normally see North Korean leaders admitting that their infrastructure perhaps isn't up to date. And so, and then he also sort of apologized for joking that he kept Moon awake at night with the missile tests.
Right.
Said, so sorry I disturbed your sleep and made you get up early in the morning to go to Security Council meetings, and Moon responding, well, now I can sleep in peace, emphasizing the peace. And so, what'd you make of it, Denise?
So, well, it was interesting. One of the things I was thinking about, and my big question for Ed and for you guys who've been following this is the difference in the leadership over these last maybe total 70 years. To me, Kim doesn't seem that different from the historical, his going back to his grandfather, saying the same kinds of things, right, doing the same kinds of things. The big difference is they're nuclearized now, right? So not a lot of different rhetoric from them. From South Korea, I think Moon is saying some different things than we've heard South Korea say in the past. So that was interesting to me. The thing we Americans love to think of North Korea still as this sort of crazy, right? He eats like sawdust for lunch or something, and we have all these myths, right, about what it is to be in North Korea, and the roads are bad, and the military is probably not fed very well, and we sort of love to hate it, but we buy into that myth, I think, of the strangeness. I think the big difference is we might have the crazy leader now. Right, who's different in this situation was what I was thinking about. Kim is very much the same. I think Moon is asking for different things and is looking towards long-term peace. U.S., though, we're being the sort of crazy actor in all of this and continuing to make all these big, bold claims, whereas that's been a very different policy that we've experienced towards North Korea for these last 70 years. I mean, the Bush administration wouldn't even admit that basically these countries existed. We're just going to ignore them, right? So this is very different in terms of that. So I'm just wondering how that geopolitically is going to play out, because the players have really changed some of their stances, except for maybe North Korea and all that. I don't know. Does that strike you as something?
Yeah, I mean, I still think the continuities outweigh the discontinuities.
Okay,
I mean, as you know, it is historic in some ways. We have a North Korean leader setting foot in the South, and that's great.
Right.
But we have had these summits before.
That's
we did
right,
one in 2000. We did another one in 2007, and a lot of the promises are the same. I agree, though, that the two differences are pretty unpredictable, to say the least, U.S. leadership, particularly in terms of what's going to happen in terms of bringing Japan and China, I think, to the table. With trade wars going on and other threats and issues going on, that's an unknown. And the nuclear issue is important. I mean, everybody made a lot of hay, a month or two ago when Kim came out and said, well, we're not going to do nuclear tests anymore. And that was hailed as some big victory. It doesn't need to test them anymore. They have the nuclear weapons. They have the nuclear capability. They're still working on the delivery mechanisms. But he doesn't need to test anymore. That's not a victory. That's a defeat if you're a U.S. from a certain U.S. perspective, in terms of he's got the capability that he worked for the last 50 years, that the regime worked for the last 50 years to develop.
So it puts him in a very different position now vis-a-vis South Korea and even the United States, right? So he's sitting in a much different, stronger strategic position.
As you've pointed out when we've talked about this before, Ron, when you think back to the axis of evil, you've got Iran, you've got North Korea, and you've got Syria. And what's the lesson of the Iraq war for this? Is that if you don't want to get invaded, develop a nuclear weapon, essentially. And then you want the other two countries that are part of that equation, Iraq and Syria, have been absolutely invaded and have been occupied and have been threatened from a variety of perspectives because they don't have or are not close to developing that nuclear capability.
Let's focus a little bit more on the U.S. roads. Is that where you're going to go
next? No, I wanted to, sort of. You said that we removed our nuclear from South Korea, all of it?
Yes, in 1991, under H.W. Bush.
So it seems like one of the games that's being played is to split South Korea from the United States, right?
Absolutely.
So what would be the implications? Is that possible? Would does South Korea still need us there from their point of view? And what are the implications for us? How do we feel about all that?
I think, it's a great question. I definitely think that part of what the North Koreans are trying to do is to drive that wedge and exploit potential wedges in the relationship with the South Koreans, but also with respect to China and Japan, because regionally it's always been about Korea, China, and Japan. The U.S. has kind of come in and out of that relationship, but I always like to remind people, most of the issues in that region are not about us. They existed long before we got there, and they will exist well into the future, I suspect. So I think there's a couple issues to think about. One is, of course, trade, that we are a huge trading partner with South Korea. We have a lot of economic interests with regard to South Korea, but also with regard to Japan, and sort of that triangular relationship is very important. And so that could be an issue, and especially with the unpredictable nature of trade and sanctions and things under the Trump regime. It's hard to know where that might go. And the other issue is that we've got 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea, and for a long time the argument has been, well, that and a bunch of landmines are the only thing standing between the North Koreans and Seoul. And the threat has always been coming from North Korea, but there's a lot of elements in South Korean society that have long been calling for the U.S. to decrease its military presence and protests around the base. And so if we continue to see the South Koreans clamoring for more independence, and if that threat from North Korea diminishes a little bit, then I think there will be calls for the U.S. to move on. Now, I see that, frankly, as a good thing. I'd like to see us decrease our military presence around the world, but I think there's a big question left unresolved about, is the threat from North Korea vis-a-vis South Korea really diminished, or is that just a short-term posturing?
So I just think about that in terms of what's happening in Japan now, Okinawa, where we're trying to build a new base, and the people are demonstrating against that. How strong is that element in South Korea saying, Yankee, go home?
Yeah, it's been growing steadily over the years. It's never been quite as pointed as it has been in Okinawa. And the base politics in Okinawa have always been sort of the prime case study for resistance to U.S. military bases since the early days of the Cold War, but they have been pretty steadily ramping up in Seoul, and there are issues with regard to sexual assault, with economic issues surrounding the base, with the military, or with the environmental impact that these military bases have. I mean, a lot of them are environmental disasters, and there are major issues of pollution related to that. So I think you're going to continue to see that, independent of what's happening with North Korea. I think you'll continue to see that growing anti-American resentment among certain segments in South Korea, particularly under a Trump administration.
Because of the advancement of the nuclearization, the U.S. and the regional geopolitics you've been describing, this is not an area where the U.S. can just sort of drop the hammer anymore either. There's So it's not surprising, I think, that some of this resistance to U.S. maybe a unifying theme is that probably China also doesn't want our troops there. Russia certainly doesn't want them there, right? There's a lot of folks who don't want the U.S. presence there, but would also like to see it stay. I guess non-Western is the best term I can think, non-communist, but not quite democratic. So that's, I think, a very unifying interest for the region, that the U.S. has to decide about, are we going to stay America first, or are we just going to level counterpunches? How do we regionally do that? And it's the trade and economics that might be the one way, right? And for me, the big message from the summit, especially from Kim, was talking about, now I've got my nuclear weapons, I'm going to focus on economics. And I think that was a message to China, who of course has opened up some of their economic markets and a little bit of freedom there, and they see that as a big move that North Korea could make to be in conjunction with China, but that might also be the U.S.'s wedge into those negotiations. But,
I mean, when Trump and Abe were having their Gulf summit, a couple weeks ago, they were, talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Trump floated briefly the idea of, well, maybe we'll join back up. And Japan isn't interested in a bilateral deal. They're more than happy to be part of that TPT and to become sort of the dominant player among the free trade nations. And China has been more than willing, of course, to say, hey, if the U.S. is going to step back from its historic role, at least over the last several decades in the Pacific, China is more than happy to step into that role politically, militarily, and economically. And it wouldn't be surprising to me to see some multilateral trade agreements come between the communist countries and the non-communist countries there. And if China and the Koreas and Japan can work out an agreement independent of the United States, that would certainly be in their best interest.
But isn't Japan afraid of China? Isn't it in Japan, see it in their interest that there be a military presence in South Korea because they see that as neutralizing China?
I think to a certain degree, yeah, although there's some interesting things with Abe too, because he's been one of the prime drivers of maybe Japan should develop its military, which it hasn't, of course, done since World War II with the Constitution that we wrote for them. And so on the one hand, yeah, I mean, I think a decreased U.S. role and certainly a decreased U.S. military presence will lead to some kind of an increase in militarism from Japan. But it's not entirely clear to me, and I'm far from a Japan expert, for sure, but it's not clear to me that there aren't some elements of Japanese society and of Abe's party in particular that want to see a growing Japanese military, and that would be the perfect excuse for them to do so.
Right.
But Japan would certainly, I would think, welcome an easing of tensions between the North and the South,
Stop
because
firing missiles at us, if nothing else.
if this turns into a hot war, I mean, who's getting targeted? I mean, well, Seoul, of course, a city of what, 30 million people or something along those lines, but of course Japan. And I think you've pointed out when North Korea was testing those intercontinental ballistic missiles, they were sending them right over Japan, and that was not an accident, right?
No, and that's what I always like to point out to people too, that we like to make this about North Korea in the United States or the Koreas in the United States, but the primary anger in that region among the Koreans has always, South and North for the most part, it's always been directed at Japan. That's their historical rival, the brutal occupation that the Japanese had going back to the early 20th century, and then certainly through the 30s and through World War II, that there's a huge degree of resentment, particularly among North Koreans, where the resistance was stronger and where the regime, where the occupation was much more brutal. And the North Korean sort of animosity in a lot of Southern society is because there were so many collaborators, if you will, sort of like Vichy in France, who collaborated with and supported the Japanese occupation during the 30s and 40s. So a lot of those tensions between North and South, but certainly between the Koreans and the Japanese, date back to that time. And that's completely, not completely independent, but it has a lot less to do with the United States than we often like to think.
You know, it was interesting, one small but interesting and diplomatic way that tried to come out. I don't know if you guys heard about the dessert controversy of what they were going to serve at this dinner for the summit. Well, the dessert that both North and South Korea, one of the big things they agreed on was that this mousse would be in the shape of a map that included the islands that are in contention with Japan. And that prompted Japan to make several very harsh statements about and wanting them to take this mousse off the menu, which they left on their menu, and to show, and I think it really speaks
Unified
to, there's this little way that we can sort of still poke Japan, and, and it speaks to this larger complexity and history of these issues in the region.
There was a similar moment at the Olympics when you had this, again, incredibly symbolic moment of the Korean delegation walking in together under a sort of unified Korean flag, and lots of interest, but up there in that awkward VIP box was Vice President Pence and Prime Minister Abe of Japan, who did not stand.
That's right.
And the way they framed it was, well, we don't want to acknowledge the North Korean regime, which, pettiness aside, whatever. But of course, they ended up insulting the South Koreans. And it was, again, this fear that, see, this is the United States and Japan out to get the Koreas. And it's those kind of messages that will bring North and South Korea more together, and this idea that there's this kind of more unified threat from abroad between Trump and Abe and between the United States and Japan that will do as much as anything else probably to move the relationship between North and South Korea forward.
Well, it's sort of a sociological truism that intergroup conflict produces intra-group solidarity.
That's right.
Exactly.
The Koreans certainly could come together because of that conflict with Japan, and it's a long-standing historical conflict, as you point out. I want to turn a little bit more to the U.S. role here. I don't see in any of the early negotiations a demand that all those U.S. troops, those 30,000 troops, be removed. But that's going to be an issue that comes up. But there's also another issue, I think, that I wanted to ask Ed about, and that is the armistice was concluded, as you mentioned, between China, the United States, and North Korea, not South Korea. But to move this from an armistice to a treaty fully diplomatically ending the war, wouldn't the United States have to recognize North Korea? We don't recognize North Korea, and we don't have diplomatic relations. Wouldn't we have to make that concession?
Yep, you can't have a treaty with a country you don't recognize.
That's right.
So there's that element, and and there's some complicated diplomacy that will absolutely play into that. How do the South Koreans feel about it? Do they eventually sign some kind of a treaty? And how do you get the Chinese on board? I mean, Trump is very fond. I think he tweeted out this morning again, praising the Chinese for their role in de-escalating the situation. But there's a lot of unresolved issues between the United States and the Chinese that would have to I would think, play into that quite a bit. And the troop issue, I think, the last thing that President Kim said openly about it was that he would be willing to tolerate sort of some remaining troops on the peninsula, which is different than he had said before. So, but that'll definitely come up as well, as will the nuclear weapons.
That's right.
A lot of diplomacy. Good thing we have such good diplomats in Washington right
Well,
now.
It does make one worry.
That's
That's
the
the
other
thing that is so different is the U.S. leadership on this issue and
Jeez.
what our position
Yeah.
is going to be and what whoever's in the room is even going to say.
And you've got people like Pompeo now that he's Secretary
right.
of
Yeah.
State, but the State Department internally, aside from that, at least we have a Secretary of State, it's a mess.
There's zero staff.
We don't have an
Jeez.
ambassador in
Right.
South Korea. We don't have a
Right.
strong presence. We don't have the staff behind the scenes, which is critical to successful treaties and diplomacy and summits.
That's right.
And we've got people like John Bolton serving as National Security
geez.
Advisor, who has long advocated for strikes against a number of countries, including North Korea. So if the voices at the table that are advocating for any kind of peace are Pompeo and Bolton, then I think
Good
we've
luck
got
with that.
a lot of
That's
work
right.
ahead of us.
Yeah, so what's going to happen at the summit?
Yeah.
Is it even going to, I mean, it looks like more and more it will happen between Trump and Kim.
Yeah.
I mean, at one point I would have even questioned that. It seems
Mm-hmm.
now that, given what's happened today, that that's even more likely to actually happen now.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when Trump sits down with Kim? Is it going to, I mean, again, I mean, let's be honest. Trump is ignorant. He's impulsive. He is reckless. He doesn't learn
Doesn't do
from
his
past
research.
mistakes. He
Right.
doesn't do any preparation. So he's going to just go in there thinking by the force of his personality, he's going to force Kim to back down and make all kinds of concessions. And that's so is this whole thing, are we just setting up for a disaster when Trump and Kim actually get together?
I mean, especially with those two. I mean, they're both
Yes.
very impulsive, unpredictable personalities in control of a nuclear arsenal. And I think Kim has clearly been playing nice and cozying up. And I think part of that is because Trump has effectively already promised that he would go do this summit. He already agreed to it publicly. Now, that doesn't mean he can't back out of it. And I don't think people would be surprised. But I think part of the goal for the North Koreans is to have that summit with the president. For them, that's a win. I mean, a
That's
sit
a
down
huge
with the
win.
president of
Right.
the United States is a
Right.
huge win. And at that point, it would not at all surprise me for Kim to completely change tacks and become the tough guy once again and become
Yes.
more of a blowhard and become, absolutely, I'm not going to denuclearize. You continue to be a threat and then put the troops back on the table and do that. I think he's going to prove to be a much stronger negotiator than people assume, and probably than our own negotiator and deal maker in chief presumes himself to be.
Kim has to go in there with demands, right? He's not going to give up the nuclear weapons unless he gains some very important concessions.
Right.
So number one, just having the meeting with the United States at that level is a victory. The second thing is getting that diplomatic recognition and then being able to conclude that peace treaty. And then it seems that there have to be some kind of security guarantees that are part of that as well. And that means that the U.S. is going to have to withdraw at least some of those troops. It's going to have to make a pledge not to attack North Korea. Can all that happen? Can all that happen?
And that doesn't even include the
The
sanctions
sanctions
questions,
or
which
the,
is right there too.
the rest of the
Right.
players,
The
like
sanctions will
you're
be
talking
there
about.
too. I mean, one of the reasons, of course, the North wants a more open relationship with the South is because any flow of
goods, is gonna
goods and
be
money and services
food.
from South to North will help ease the effects of the sanctions,
Right.
which have no effect on the regime. They have an effect on the North Korean people.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The regime is not going hungry and starving, but the North Korean people might if the
Right.
sanctions regime continues. So that'll be on the table too. So that would be an awfully ambitious agenda for any summit, particularly one that had been really well thought out and
Exactly.
months and months of negotiation behind the scenes with diplomats and with Japan and China, of course, involved too. And it's hard to imagine that happening, at least, I mean, if we're still talking about May or June,
Yeah.
potentially for a Kim and Trump summit,
Does
that
Trump
seems unlikely.
now? Trump's getting, in right-wing circles, Trump's getting all the credit for this summit, right?
Yeah.
And Trump, I'm sure, believes that the only reason all this is moving forward is because he threatened to annihilate North Korea. He was the tough guy. He threatened to fire and fury, and that's the reason all this is happening. I think that's a fundamental misreading of the situation, as we've just been discussing. But if Trump believes that's what has moved us to this point, and he's going to dance into that summit thinking that and not being prepared for the demands that are going to be coming from Kim, we could be setting ourselves up for a diplomatic disaster here, right? I mean, I want to be optimistic, but I'm also looking at the dark side of this.
Yeah.
Don, what do you think?
Well, what does Trump want out of it? What would be
Exactly.
Trump's? What would, okay, we just said what Kim is looking for as he goes in. What's Trump looking for as he goes in? He wants the complete removal of the nuclear weapons. What else does he
Right now,
Which
and
is
he wants it
never
to happen
gonna happen.
fast, right? He wants.
Right.
It's not going to
That's-
happen.
No, it's not going to happen, and it's not clear why he wants that, right? I think
Exactly.
all he really wants at
Exactly.
the end of the day is a deal,
Yep.
right? So he can go back and say, I made a great deal. We have all these bad Obama deals because everything's a deal to him. So as long as he can come away with a deal
Yeah.
that he can frame as a
And
win,
look
I think-
powerful
exactly.
And
Uh,
to one up
assert-
Obama.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah,
Everything.
it's
is
Nobody's
one up Obama.
nobody's
One up
done the
Obama.
kind of things
It's,
that I could
it's
do.
image, right?
It's
I mean,
nonsense.
Nixon went to China. Trump invited
Right.
North Korea. That's how they're going to play these things. Look at how the great relations that
Yeah.
I'm able to have. But I think that Trump is unfortunately everything we've seen is going to go in and saber rattle some more, and that's his only. His only game plan. Kim has the upper hand on
That's what
every
I think.
single one of these
Yeah.
issues, and is probably going to walk out of there with not
Yeah.
just the legitimacy. He's going to end up looking very rational to the rest of the world, which then gives him more leverage to go back and make these
right.
geopolitical other treaties in the region.
Yeah.
And he looks like a sane, rational player next to
And of
Trump.
course-
I mean, it's huge for Kim.
In between now and then, and I know we might get back to this later, but in between now and then, Trump's got to make a decision on Iran. So in the
Yes.
context of
Soon,
a deal
real
and a
soon.
potential nuclear deal with North
Exactly.
Korea, if he comes in and backs out in the middle of the Iran deal and says, no, we're not doing this, we're not renewing the agreement, what kind of message does that send about what it means to negotiate a deal or some kind of treaty or some kind of an agreement with the United States? And if it's subject to the whims of whoever happens to be in charge at a given moment, that doesn't really strengthen your negotiating hand necessarily as you go into talks with the North Koreans.
So Trump has said, well, if I don't think we're going to get anything, we're not going to go. So
I'll walk away. I'll
Walk away.
I'll walk
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, might not even go.
Respectfully, but I'll walk out.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wouldn't be surprised he backed out of it.
Yeah.
so
No, I
think,
wouldn't
because
either.
he's going in with a weak hand, and
Very
Kim's
weak.
going in with a very strong hand.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
The Iran thing is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, we just saw that President Macron from France was here, and there was sort of a nice bromance going on between Trump and Macron while he was here. But President Macron was very insistent about the Iran deal. But he seemed very pessimistic at the end that Trump is really going to do this, that he is going to blow this up. And so again, it seems interesting. Here we have, so the concern with North Korea is that they have nuclear weapons, right? And we want them to get rid of them. Iran does not yet have nuclear weapons, right? We don't want them to get them. And we've concluded a historic agreement with them not to move down that path. And we've got our European partners, a strong part of that. And but because it was Obama that negotiated that,
Right.
Trump calls it a bad deal, horrible, wants to get rid of it. And there doesn't seem to be any rational points there. I mean, he seems to want to say, well, it doesn't involve Iran's intercontinental ballistic tests. Well, it wasn't intended to. It was about developing nuclear weapons. It doesn't have anything to do with their support of Assad and support of other groups in the Middle East that from his perspective, are causing trouble. And it's not a permanent long-term deal necessarily. But most of these negotiations wouldn't go that direction anyhow. So he seems to be raising all kinds of issues that seem to be missing the point of the main part of the deal, which is to have Iran stop its nuclear weapons program. There are inspections to ensure that. Iran seems to be in complete compliance at this point, based on international observers. So why blow this deal up, and why? And again, as you mentioned, Ed, if he wrecks this deal, then what incentive does North Korea have to sign any kind of deal with this if we're not going to keep our bargain here?
Exactly.
Right.
Well, of course, there's no larger strategy. I mean, that much is clear. And it is true that, the treaty was about the nuclear program. It wasn't about all these other things. But I think it's also true that if you blow up that deal,
Right.
it doesn't help. The deal is still connected to those other diplomatic and military issues in the region. It has a lot to do. You blow up that deal, you're going to see a very different relationship with regards to what's going on in Syria and with regards to what's going on in Yemen, and how the United States triangulates that with the Saudis and with the Iranians and with the other groups in the region. with Hamas. I mean, all these different things are going to be back on the table in a much different way if the Iranian deal blows up, because then what incentive at all do the Iranians have to cooperate with the United States on anything by proxy or whatever it looks like? It changes the calculus.
Maybe Trump doesn't care about any of that. Maybe all he cares about is his base. And he promised his base that he was going to get rid of this treaty. So all the other things you're talking about are rational, and that's not on his agenda.
Absolutely not.
His agenda is to keep his base. I mean, that's the scary part to me.
It's scary because it leads to war.
That's right.
It does lead to war. I mean, it's a catch-22 for Iran, right? So Iran has signed an agreement saying they won't develop their nuclear weapons, right? Well, then if we blow that deal up, then, okay, what are they going to conclude? Well, we have to look what happened in North Korea. They developed the weapons, look at what's happening with there. So they move toward doing that. Then Trump says, well, you can't develop nuclear weapons, and I'm going to now attack you. And of course, this is Bolton. Bolton has been wanting a preemptive strike against Iran for forever. And so this is a path that leads directly to war, but it's a catch-22 for Iran. If they sign an agreement saying they won't develop nuclear weapons, the United States schedules it, then they start to develop, then they get attacked. So what you know, from Iran's perspective, which we never take, we never see the world from the point of view of our opponents, do we? We never take their perspective on what their concerns and their fears might be. But you know, again, from Iran's perspective, what are they supposed to do?
Well, and of course, you've got the internal politics of Iran, too. You've had these groups that are protesting and reforming. You've had these moments of change. And again, unlike the Obama administration, which tried very much to keep all that at a distance and not get involved and not comment and say, you know, in general, we support democracy and freedom of choice in the Middle East, but that's an internal Iranian issue. And Trump just couldn't help himself by jumping into the fray. And immediately what that does, again, is inject that unified threat from outside.
Strengthens the hardliners.
Strengthens the hardliners' hand. And so, I mean, again, there's not only is there not a strategy, but just the nuts and bolts of how to conduct diplomacy and statecraft is so absent with somebody who's just randomly tweeting in the morning. And I agree 100% that with Bolton and Pompeo on board, they're going to be a much stronger advocate for intervening in an Iranian situation and probably blowing up that deal than anything with regard to North Korea. I think they're much more focused on
It's the simplification of these foreign policies that I think really irritates me the most. You know, Trump's speech, and you think you can pull one little strand out of that and say, well, this is now a terrible deal, without looking at the totality of the hundreds of different agreements and concessions that were made that made that one thing even possible, right?
Exactly.
And not being able to judge those kinds of things. But I think you're right about the base, Don, and I think, you know, why Korea is different in a Donald Trump's mind and to the base than Iran and that deal. It's all about Islam. It's all about the ISIS. It's the ethnicity. It's the ethnic regional differences in the Middle East, and that allows him to do different things because he knows when he talks to his base, I think that's what they're all talking about, and that underlies that's different. You know, if Korea was unified, I think they don't have as maybe I don't understand it as well, but not as many ethnic differences, right, as a region like the Middle East has. Right.
Does Trump have the authority to just by himself release these nuclear weapons? Yes? I thought that was being debated. No, they're saying he does. Huh?
People debate it from time to time, and there have been some discussions in Congress, even on the Foreign Relations Committee, but I forget if it was them or Armed Services, but whatever it was. But no, I mean, he absolutely does. Now, there's people who could disobey commands, but no, this is one of the issues, and I mean, Ron's been very eloquent on this in the past, that nuclear weapons, that's why they're so scary.
That's right.
So Elaine Scarry at Harvard University has a book called Thermonuclear Monarchy. And her point is that, of course, nuclear weapons have changed everything. And the fact is that, you know, now we have one person who can decide whether to end the world or not, right? And to take the country to war, but of course a catastrophic apocalyptic war. That's a total violation of the Constitution, of course. You know, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives the authority to go to war to Congress, and Congress only, right? But that can't operate with nuclear weapons, right? You can't have a congressional debate about whether you're going to have a first strike with nuclear weapons, or if you're even going to have a retaliatory strike, right? It's just not something that can happen. And so Elaine Scarry says, well, you can either have the nuclear weapons, which have to be in the control of one person or a small group of persons, or you can have your democratic institutions and your constitutional provisions, but you can't have both.
That's right.
And so to maintain the Constitution in the form that it's in, with vesting in Congress the decision to go to war, you have to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Right.
That's her point. But of course, that would be the case even if it was Barack Obama or George Herbert Walker Bush or anybody. And Scary's book came out before Donald Trump was elected, so it's not a point about Trump. But of course, now that we have an ignorant, impulsive, aggressive, immoral, vindictive person in the White House, the fact that that person has control over nuclear weapons and can make that decision to use these weapons makes things even more scary.
Yeah.
When the thermonuclear monarchy involves King Donald Trump, then we really have to be concerned, I think.
No, and I appreciate your use of King Trump, because what we call that in political science is an autocracy, right? And we want to say that's what North Korea is and Iran is. We would rather call it elitism in the United States, but it's an autocracy when a very small group of people are the only ones that have influence over the most important decisions. It's not the will of the people. We see that on many issues, from nuclear to environmental to prisons to, every public poll goes against, right? So that's called autocracy.
And of course, the Trump people, when they tried to justify the bombing in Syria, so General Mattis came on and said, well, the president has ordered this under his, Article 2 provisions as commander-in-chief. Well, again, that's a complete misreading and misunderstanding of the Constitution. The president is not a permanent commander-in-chief, although we've sort of become de facto.
We're a permanent war.
Because we're at permanent war, we have a permanent national security state. We have sort of moved in that direction. But according to the Constitution, the president only becomes the commander-in-chief after the Congress decides to declare war.
Right.
After the Congress has declared war and decided that we need to create an army and move the Navy into operation, then the president becomes the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. But not until they're called into service.
Right.
It's not a permanent position, although we've sort of made it that way. And of course, Congress has completely abdicated their Article 1 responsibilities. And there's even some discussion now about creating a new authorization to use military force with regard to the global war on terrorism, which I think would be a horrible mistake. The one that was created right after 9/11, I think, has been used as a very elastic, open-ended kind of power for the president to launch wars that seem to have no relation whatsoever to the 9/11 attackers, right? Of course, then you've got the War Powers Resolution that Congress tried to impose after Vietnam, and of course that's routinely violated, is a very weak instrument. So Congress is spineless in this regard, and they've abdicated their historic and constitutional duties. So we're stuck with a thermonuclear monarchy, unfortunately.
It's interesting. It's always been this strategy argument. Well, if folks knew we were at war, then we wouldn't be able to do the first strikes or have, plans that the enemy didn't know about. Well, no, you declare war and then you allow those things to unfold, and you have your secrecy and your military tactics. And we've really been boondoggled on the switch of that argument to say this is what we need in order to be strategic, which is just undemocratic, right?
It's undemocratic, and so we have, you have the Pentagon and the State Department, right? So the Pentagon is the right arm, and it's massive, and we're funded to the tune of $1 trillion, muscles rippling all over, and then you've got this shriveled little arm over here called the State Department, which was true even before Tillerson took over, until Tillerson has further reduced the ability and capabilities, and now Pompeo, I can't see him coming in and reasserting diplomacy as so again, we only know one way. We only have one hammer in our toolbox, right? And that's the hammer of the military and warfare. And with the Trump people, I mean, it's a cliche, but all I keep thinking about in terms of diplomacy is a bull in a china shop, right? That's really what we have with the people that are supposed to be in charge of diplomatic relations right now.
Yeah, it's this idea that, I've learned a lot from reading the books on Vietnam, and that we've talked about on the show several times, of American exceptionalism. I mean, what does Trump get out of this? right? Or what do you want to look like you have the moral victory over North Korea. Why can we bomb Syria? Oh, because you guys are using chemical weapons. That's why we're going to allow that sort of strike, right? And it's the same, it feeds into the same sort of idea, I feel like.
Well, the most nonsensical part about the Syria thing was that it was you've used biological or you've used chemical weapons and threatened, the safety and well-being of your people.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we've accepted
That's exactly right.
19 refugees from Syria this
Right.
year, whatever the ridiculous number
Right.
is.
Right.
So we're so concerned with the suffering of the Syrian people
That's right.
in a war that we have done as much as just about anybody to prolong and
Cause
worsen.
and,
So we'll intervene and we'll fire weapons at you,
Right.
but we won't accept Syrian refugees in.
I mean, if that's not American exceptionalism, I don't know what is, right? Let's view this only through our eyes, and we still have to be the good guys somehow, right? A lot of the other criticism has been, well, if that's the standard, what about the pipeline protesters at Dakota Access, who we've used chemical warfare on in our own country? Shouldn't we also be sanctioned? We're now guilty of the same offense that we did strikes on Syria too, right? But no one talks about that.
To say nothing about Agent Orange, you've written a book
Exactly.
about Agent Orange, the use of that during Vietnam. In Iraq, we've used depleted uranium shells. We routinely have used white phosphorus.
Right.
So we don't come to the table with clean hands when we talk about Assad's use of chemical weapons.
No.
We've done it in far greater volume over the years in different situations. And so, again, it comes back to this sort of, so there's a sort of underlying hypocrisy, right? The United States has thousands of nuclear weapons. If North Korea develops one, that's bad. They can't have them, right? Iran can't have it, right? North Korea, we need it for our national defense. No, you're a threat. You're going to use them in a bad way. We have them, but we're only going to use them in a good way. We're the good guys. This is American exceptionalism. Obviously, you would only do bad things with them if you're Iran or North Korea. And so you can't have them. We can have as many as we need for our national defense, but you can't have any. And we'll actually go to war. We'll actually go to war to preempt you from gaining those weapons.
Right.
So where's our...
Exactly.
I mean, and then you look at our collaboration with Saudi Arabia in Yemen and what's going on there. If there's one object in the world where we can look at human rights violations, it's Yemen. But we don't. We just go right in. We just give them all the support they need to do that. So our vision of the U.S. as the champion of human rights is way gone. Way gone.
And Trump doesn't want to play cop of the world. Right? That's the whole America First thing. We're just only going to go in and do counter sucker punches, apparently, when we feel like it supports the base or the ethnic or morality viewpoint that sells to that particular base.
And you did see, it was interesting with the Syria attacks, you did see some cracks in the base. You did see some people on what I would consider the far right, who would be Trump supporters in most parts, speaking out and saying, no, he's been co-opted or corrupted by the establishment and the neocons. And Bolton's certainly not going to do anything to get them away from that. But it'll be interesting to see if he continues down that road. If the base, to go back to your point, if they stick with him on that, I think they're probably more likely to go along with some of the foreign policy things. As long as we're hitting people over there, people don't really care that much more so than on some of these economic issues. But we'll see. I mean, there were some cracks there, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
And another, I think, important issue that often gets completely ignored, overlooked in the United States is the role of international law. And just with regard to the nuclear weapons issue, it's very clear that any use or threat to use or even continued possession of nuclear weapons is illegal under international law. Now, that was the ruling of the International Court of Justice, the World Court, back in 1996. They were asked to give an advisory opinion. They gave their opinion. They said, look, there's no treaty or protocol that specifically prohibits nuclear weapons at that time, but any use or threat to use would be illegal under international humanitarian law, the laws of war. You can never match the principles of international humanitarian law with nuclear weapons usage. And so they did say that under that body of law, a very extensive, long-standing body of law, that the use of nuclear weapons would be illegal. And then they added in, oh, by the way, in 1968, the world came together and agreed to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Non-proliferation
Those
treaty,
countries
right.
that didn't already have them said, we're not going to develop them. And the nuclear weapon states
Right.
at that time said, okay, if you agree to that, we'll get rid of ours, we'll disarm. And of course, they've never done that.
Right.
In fact, what's happening right now is a over $1 trillion modernization
Yeah.
of our.
Which
of our,
Obama agreed to.
Which Obama started, yeah, and we have to point that out. It's not just been under
Right.
Trump. Trump is continuing, and the Trump nuclear posture review actually makes things even worse because now they're envisioning new,
Yeah.
developing new kinds of weapons and lowering the threshold for the possible use of those weapons, and so. You know, we're heading down a path, but obviously we're a complete violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We are legally bound to disarm under that treaty, and we haven't done it since 1968. Well, now, just last summer at the United Nations, a treaty was agreed to. 122 nations of the world voted for a complete ban, a complete prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now, the 9 nuclear weapons states
Didn't sign it.
participate. Well, they didn't participate at
Yeah.
all. They basically said, no, you can't. You guys can't talk about this. You know, you guys can't do that.
Right.
But, but they did it over there. So now
Right.
we do actually have
Right.
a treaty, a draft treaty, and as soon as there are 50 signatories to that treaty, it does go into effect. And at that point, nuclear weapons will be prohibited by international law. That means the United States and Russia and North Korea, Israel, all 9 will be in violation of this law. Now, there's obviously no enforcement mechanism, right?
Right, right.
The main enforcement mechanism for international law is always the Security Council, and given the veto power of the permanent members, it's almost impossible to do anything there. So there's no way to enforce this, but it will be now the international law. So there's a treaty banning weapons, there's the international humanitarian law argument, there's the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So in every direction that you look with regard to international law, nuclear weapons are illegal, and we should be moving ahead toward disarmament. But we completely ignore that law, and so even, and again, there's another aspect of international law that I think is very important to continue to point out to, and I sound like a Pollyanna every time I talk about it, but the United Nations Charter, Article 2, Section 4, says that all nations of the world are prohibited from using military force in their foreign relations. There's just 2 very narrow exceptions to that. One is if you're directly attacked, you can respond and defend yourself. The other is if the Security Council does come together, recognizes a threat to world peace and security, exhausts all the diplomatic and peaceful ways of resolving it, then they can authorize the use of military force. And that almost never happens. It's only happened like 2 or 3 times in history. So without those 2 narrow exceptions, any use of military force is absolutely prohibited. So the strike on Syria is a violation of international law. It's just, you can't do that. You just can't do that under international law. But we routinely do that, as do other nations, right? It's not just the United States. But, and again, that's why I say it sounds Pollyannish to come back and say, well, you know, the UN has tried to prohibit war, right? It's tried to prohibit the use of military force. And it's true, we have done that, but again, the enforcement mechanism's not there. The nations of the world are not willing to give up enough of their sovereignty to allow for some efficient effective enforcement mechanism. So we're left with, again, oh yeah, that's pie in the sky up there, that international law stuff, that's the
Doesn't figure at all into the discussion.
realpolitik.
The key, exactly. Well, and the key word you said was sovereignty. No one's willing to give up their sovereignty to the international body and and make that happen. Especially if I hold power, I have hegemony because I have nuclear weapons. So, I mean, we're really in
kind of
a
the
rock and a
defining
hard
issue of the
spot,
day,
right?
It goes back to climate change and things like
Same
that.
thing.
We have all these issues that require multilateral,
That's right.
multi-institutional global solutions, and we have a system set up on sovereign nation states that's not designed to solve those problems.
Exactly. Yeah. Institutions of the past, right? By the time we create them, they're out of date, as a very famous political scientist once said. So what's the future? That was pretty, I don't know if we can end there. I can't handle that.
Well, I you know, when I gave the talk the other night, I said there were a number of failures here. Failure of international law, failure of our constitutional system of checks and balances, the failure to be able to adopt the point of view of the opposing nations, the failure of not understanding our own motives and forces that drive our, imperial forces that drive our foreign policy, and American exceptionalism. But I also said I think that the peace movement has to bear some responsibility
Right.
here. I think that we don't have the kind of broad-scale organized international peace movement that we need that could intervene here, that could play a role in this process. Now, I do want to point out that there is a group that lobbied for the nuclear weapons ban, the International Committee to Ban Nuclear Weapons, and they won the Nobel
Nobel
Peace
Peace
Prize
Prize.
last year.
Yeah.
So it's not that we don't have some of these organizations, but we
Right.
just need a lot more of them, and I think a strengthened peace movement would be one counterweight, one counterbalance to what's happening.
Yeah.
It just, to me, it's about elections. I mean, people to say elections don't matter, and I mean, that's where the decisions are being made. And unless we really get people together and force this November to be a sea change, these things are really
Right.
trouble.
Got to be able to hold people accountable.
Right.
That's what
Right.
democratic institutions are supposed to be about, which means bringing up these issues, which means calling people out, which means all of those things, not just voting and then,
No, it's the
paying
movement,
attention to that
the
record.
movement that has to demand. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
And that's the only way it's going to happen.
I see a lot of hope for the regional agreement, actually. I think China, Japan, the Koreas are going to do their thing without the U.S. We're already seeing Germany and Japan, Germany and China, all sorts of other people making decisions without us. And eventually we're going to realize it's not America first. We're being left out.
I think so.
So
We
Trump's
just-
going to get his wish of being isolated, and it's all about us. And they say, okay, it's all about you, but
America
we do our own
first,
thing.
right? And that was the isolationist call back in the 40s,
That's right.
right?
That's
Or 30s and 40s,
Right.
America first.
Right.
Charles Lindbergh held
Yeah.
huge rallies. We just have about a minute left, so Don, just to follow up on one point you made, I do think that the elections matter, but if there is a blue wave and the Democrats do take back the Congress, being the most optimistic, there still has to be pressure coming
Yes.
from the peace
Absolutely.
groups, right?
Absolutely.
Because we've already pointed out, Obama started the nuclear modernization. He said we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons. We didn't
Right.
do that, and the thermonuclear monarchy was there no matter if we have a Democratic president or a Republican
the
president.
movement, it has to come from the people.
We have to have
mobilized.
a peace movement that's engaged in a more broad bipartisan effort to
I agree,
forthrightly
totally.
deal with these issues.
Totally.
Well, we're just about out of time, so Ed, I want to thank you very much. It's great to
Thank
have
you.
you
That's
come on, and especially if your burgeoning awareness and knowledge about Korea.
No choice right
You've
now,
got
I
a
guess.
new
Another
gig
expert
going
area.
on here with
That's right.
the Korean issue, and I think it's only going to grow stronger. Thanks to Denise and to Don, our regular viewmeisters.
Sure.
And we'd like to thank you for joining us on Critical Issues Alternative Views. We hope to see you back again soon.